Hi, and thank you for joining this session on resilience. And this is part of a series of talks that I'm doing on building organisational change capability. And these change capability talks are here to give you an overview of the subject matter and to give you references so that you can deeper dive yourself into the various topics. And this session on resilience is part of a series of building change capability talks that I'm running, and we have done ones on trust in leadership, fairness in decision making, psychological safety, organisational support and relationships, and you can go to my YouTube channel to watch those. So at Ebb and Flow, we take a more holistic approach to organisational change, trying to understand how different elements of people's experience of working in organisations affect the capability of that organisation to change. And this framework contrasts with the perspective that people want to be treated as unique individuals against their drive to belong to something bigger than themselves. So on that vertical axis there, you can see at the top uniqueness, the drive to flourish, and at the bottom this sense of belonging and belonging to something bigger than oneself. This drive to belong. And then on the other axis, on the horizontal axis, we have this idea that we can only achieve or do things through how people are with one another. So we contrast the being, how we are with one another, which is the sort of internal perspective, how the organisation is within itself and how individuals are within themselves, and the perspective of doing, which in the individual case is the individual behaviours, or the organisation, what we see the organisation, how it performs in its particular context. And then you can see in this diagram that this gives us these quadrants. So in the top right hand quadrant, we have the external perspective of the individual. So as I mentioned, these are the behaviours that are important for organisational change. And then we have the organisational external perspective, this bottom right corner, which makes that organisation unique, which is its sense of purpose, the process that it has, the leadership, etc. And the bottom left is the internal perspective of belonging, these interpersonal relationships that make up the culture. And at the top left, internal personal internal personal perspective, which is where we sort of have our beliefs about the world, and this is where resilience fits in. So our belief of how well we can bounce back from adverse situations. But you can see these other factors here: adaptability, autonomy and efficacy. We all know that these are critical in driving employee well-being. And I use this framework to help organisations to create organisational change strategies and understand which capabilities to focus on, triangulating the staff priority scores that we get, which is indicated here by the size of the segments, with the performance, which is the colour of the segments. So red is bad and green is good here, and then using these lines that show the intercorrelation between the different factors. So in this example here, you can see resilience has got lots of lines coming out of it, and the thickness of those lines represents the strength of the correlation. So people feel here that support is important for resilience. There's a strong correlation between support and resilience. Leadership, purpose, fairness, goal-directed behaviour, and performance are all highly correlated with resilience. And we know, for instance, that if people don't have a sense of purpose, it's very difficult for them to, or it becomes more difficult for them to bounce back from adverse situations. And also, leadership, we know here is a low score. So we can see this orange colour, and so it's important from a strategic perspective to understand what the relationship is between, say, resilience and leadership, because we know that leadership is a key driver of resilience. But if leadership is scoring low, how do we get that score up to drive resilience further? So rather than focusing on resilience in this case, we might want to focus on building leadership skills that we know then drive resilience. So this helps to formulate a strategy for the organisation to build change capability. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about why resilience is so important, what it is, and how do we make it work in practice. So why do I think resilience is so important? So I think when we're talking about concepts, or constructs in organisational development, it's always good to track back on the history and understand where these ideas have come from. And I think the idea of organisational resilience and individual resilience, and we'll talk about this distinction between those later, sort of stems from this idea that workplaces are social and that people are motivated by social interaction rather than self-interest, and that comes through in Mayo's work in the early 30s, and then White in the late 50s, when he talks about people having this sort of collectivist view or ethic rather than the prevailing notion, which was then and maybe now, that people pursue sort of individual or motivated by individual pursuits. And this is, I guess, against a backdrop in biology where people are starting to think about biological systems as open systems, that they can exchange energy with their environment and they're affected by their environment. So we're not machines, and equally, organisations aren't machines either. They're not closed off from their environment. So then you get these ideas, or that idea sort of perpetuated by or built on by Thompson and his level model, where he says there's sort of two domains within organisations: a stable core where there's sort of structure, and organisations must craft the appropriate structure for their environment, and then there's a sort of outer layer that's absorbing the sort of external pressures and stresses, but then there's that sort of works into this idea of contingency theory, that we need to adapt according to the circumstances that organisations operating in, and different leadership styles, where you get sort of transformational leadership styles from. And then that idea is sort of developed further, where you get the sort of evolutionary approach to organisational change and resilience and robustness, and that school of thought sort of argues that there's a process of natural selection that occurs at a population level, where the environment sort of blindly selects organisations on the basis of how fit they are, and that feels quite a sort of deterministic view that organisations are just at the mercy of their environment. And then you get more strategic approach with the which suggests that senior leaders are there sort of scanning the environment and looking for opportunities, and then adapt the organisation according to the opportunities they want to pursue. But that view sort of tends to ignore the idea that organisations have these sort of internal elements and the culture, and the kind of culture that you need to build in order to be adaptive. And then in the early 1980s, you probably get the sort of clearest conceptualization of organisational resilience by Storm and Meyer, who observed how organisations are sort of jolted by external environments, and they're sort of pushed away from their day-to-day environments, day-to-day operations, and they suggest that organisations can either absorb and use their redundancy, such as employee resilience, or money in the bank, or whatever it is, or they can adapt through adopting new ways of working. But they didn't sort of answer this question about how organisations avoid threat rigidity and how to actually build resilience. So then we have the idea of there were lots of large-scale accidents like Chernobyl and Exxon Valdez and the space shuttle sort of disaster. So then there came the idea of organisational reliability, which is built through the robustness of internal processes. It's how organisations learn and act without knowing in advance what the situation is. So how do you build an organisation that can basically sort of be responsive and have robust enough processes to be able to stop these big sort of accidents from occurring? And then you move back, that's a process focus, and you move back to a sort of people focus with Weck and Roberts, who talk about the collective mind and talk about the importance of interrelationships between employees and how that creates robustness and resilience, and that happens through kind of improvisation and that's moving away, as I say, from the sort of process focus. But the actual first mention of employee individual resilience comes through Block and Block's sort of work, and they see it as a trait within individuals, the ability to be able to modify and contextualize your sort of ego, so that you're altering your ego according to the context, and that kind of moves into more emotional stability type work, which went off in a different direction. So it didn't directly contribute to individual resilience, which started the idea of individual resilience started after the 9/11 kind of attacks, and the idea that some people seem to respond to those kind of disasters better than others, and that came from positive psychology. And then we're using ideas around self-efficacy and learned optimism from Sevelman, and this was all about how do we build psychological capital, which is sort of more people who are more sort of optimistic and cope with these kind of setbacks. And then you get the sort of hope theory, which we're going to talk about later. So that's a brief history of moving from organisational resilience to concepts of individual resilience. And organisational resilience is still out there as a concept, and we will talk about that and whether that's still a valid sort of concept. And then what does, so that's the historical background. So what does the research tell us about resilience? And it seems to suggest that there are these predictors of resilience and these outcomes. And here we're talking about individual resilience. So what are the drivers of resilience? There's a sense of coherence, which we talked about, the correlation between resilience and purpose, which I showed you in the model at the beginning, and then the idea of setting clear direction, having a clear direction, information sharing and treating people with dignity and respect, giving people this idea of sort of self-efficacy, that they can be themselves at work as well, social support, particularly from managers, but also organisational policies around how we support people and their well-being, and then more specifically positive interpersonal relationships with managers. So all of these things help individuals bounce back from adverse conditions, and the outcome of that is that we get increased or better performance, because we get these organisational citizenship behaviours, or these sort of proactive behaviours of people helping each other out, and we get more creative behaviours and more proactive behaviours that help people cope with stress, and we get an increasing commitment to change. So people are willing to be held accountable for change, because they know that if they do fall over, that in order to bounce back, there is that social support from managers, and they have a clear direction of where they're going, etc. So resilience, we know from the research, is really critical for change, because this is kind of exactly what we need from change. We need the extra energy, we need people to support each other, and we need the commitment to the change as well. And this diagram tries to sort of more neatly summarize that research, and this was taken from the research conducted by CIPD, and it's just saying again these predictors of resilience, such as self-efficacy, positive effect, sense of coherence, social support, and leader-member exchange, which is about the relationships between leaders and members of their teams, are all drivers of resilience, and then these outcomes that we've discussed here. And later on we'll talk about this idea of absorb and adapt, which we mentioned earlier in terms of in the context of organisational level resilience. And another reason why resilience is so important is because I think it ties into ideas around behavioural change models, and this is the theory of planned behaviour, and there's the COM-B model as well, which I think is a variation of this model. And what Ajzen is saying is that if we combine efficacy, the belief that I can do, and I know I've got a support network around me, and if I have the sort of attitude, a positive attitude towards the change, and I can see why the change is beneficial, then I will create these sort of intentions to change my behaviour, and then we will see behavioural change, and obviously behavioural change will then lead to sort of overall organisational change. But then if I do fall over and I get things wrong whilst I'm experimenting, I've got to have this way power, that I believe this is worthwhile, which is where the resilience comes in, and we know that resilience is related to purpose. So I've got to have this sort of clear direction and or pathway to a sort of better future, a different future. And at the top here I put in autonomy as being the sort of glue, as it were, or the feedback loop that helps people believe that they can do. So this is, they continue with the willpower, because autonomy is about having control over what I do, having control over my actions, and those actions being goal directed. So that's a fairly sort of straightforward model of behavioural change that hopefully ties in resilience. So this is potentially a useful model in terms of bringing all the different aspects of resilience together. And this is taken from positive psychology and formulated by Fred Luthers, and it's basically saying that if we can bring these four areas together, hope, efficacy, resilience and optimism, then we can build psychological capital within organisations, which is a positive state of people's development. And we know that it's got lots of benefits in terms of improving job satisfaction, organisational commitment, psychological well-being, desirable employee behaviours and performance. Kind of creates the right conditions for change, and it's a useful acronym, but I think it's potentially a bit confused, because we know that a sense of purpose, efficacy and optimism are all drivers of resilience. But I think if you bear that in mind, it's probably an easy way to remember how these four important aspects fit together in terms of building resilience and a positive mindset for change. So here I'm just trying to I'll attempt to go through why I think resilience and is so important, robustness is so important for complex systems. So complex systems are robust because they are because they have redundancy within them. And I think resilience, individual resilience, if you think about it as a sort of a budget of energy that we have to give to the organisation, and if a lot of that is taken up with our day-to-day, then when change comes along, we are working with a sort of limited amount of energy. And that energy, if you take that at a whole organisational level, you've got all this individual energy around. So when we're asking people to change, there's a sort of a cushion that an organisation has, or if it has a shock from outside, there's a cushion there where people can absorb that additional work because they have resilience, they have this sort of stock of energy. And obviously there's a certain level that you can take that to, and there's a limited amount of energy as well, and there's a limited point to where you start to affect people's levels of anxiety and depression that are associated with low levels of resilience. And if you think about our bodies, are able to adapt because we've got numerous sort of systems, respiratory system, muscular, digestive, etc., with different types of cells that perform different functions, and all these systems feed back into one another, allowing us to get back to a level of equilibrium. So that also that disorder and diversity, so it's not just numerosity, the number of people that creates a cushion, but it's also the diversity of people that allows a system to adapt as well. And this creates resilience to outside forces. So if you think about our body, we shiver to stay warm, so there's a certain part of our body that's performing that function. So maybe an organization, for instance, is become sort of has cash flow problems, so you'll go to your finance department to sort out the cash flow problem, or maybe we have sort of people problems. So you have different areas that diverse areas, people with diverse skills who are able to bring their particular knowledge to solve particular issues that these external forces that are causing the change are creating. And all those systems obviously have these feedback loops, and then allow the system to create equilibrium, and so that creates robustness within the system and resilience as well. So at the next sort of level down, at a sort of cognitive level, and understanding the mechanics of complex systems, which are also the mechanics of neuroscience as well, that at a cognitive level, if we adapt to external events that challenge our beliefs, so an event happens and it challenges our beliefs on how we think things are, jolts us out of our equilibrium. So neuroscience suggests that we make predictions or inferences about how our world should be, and if it's not, if our predictions aren't in line with the way the world is, i.e. because there's been a change, then we have this sort of sense of divergence, or a sort of unexplained information. We call it uncertainty. So we then become uncertain about our world because we can't predict it, or our beliefs don't fit with it. And this idea of uncertainty or unexplained information is called free energy. It's basically a prediction error. And in that situation, I mean, this is happening all the time. We have two choices. We can either change our perceptions and our beliefs, so we can go away and read up and try and understand, what's going on, or try and run surveys or whatever it is to try and understand what's going on, or we can act in a world to get the observations that fit with our beliefs. So we can essentially just stick our head in the sand and sort of ignore what's going on, and only surround ourselves with things that are working the way that we kind of expect it to. And maybe this is, we'll talk about cognitive behavioural therapy later, but this is maybe why cognitive behavioural therapy is effective, because it's a form of treatment that aims to help people identify how their perceptions affect their world, and how we see and act upon our world. and how when we act upon the world, that then affects our sort of perceptions. So maybe that's why, we'll come on to this later, CBT is potentially a good form of therapy or a way of helping build individual resilience. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about why resilience is so important, what it is, and how do we make it work in practice. So we talked about why resilience is so important. In the following section, we're going to talk about how we define resilience. So what is resilience? So before we get into individual resilience, I thought it'd just be worth really reflecting on where the sort of literature is on organisational resilience. And you remember there were lots of sort of different phases of evolution of organisational resilience, and we have the levels model, which is looking at the inside and the outside of the organisation, the structure inside, and this sort of absorption level outside the organisation. And then we move on to the ecological view, which is very much focused on the outside, that the outside determines which organisations survive and which ones don't. And then the strategic view, which looks inside, which looks at the capability of an organisation to adapt through its strategies. And again, looking at the inside, the sort of threat rigidity idea, and how organisations absorb these sudden shocks. And again, with reliability, that organisations should focus on robust internal processes. And then there's this collective mind idea, or I guess it's similar to collective intelligence, where organisations become responsive to their environment through the interrelationships of individuals, and through, say, improvisation. And these are all obviously great ideas, but and organisational resilience has increased in popularity, since the 2000s, particularly since sort of 2010 and 2015 and 20, but it suffers from construct validity, because there are 71 different definitions. Clearly, all these definitions that you see here are all slightly different, and there are 22 distinct different attributes which have been identified of organisations that are resilient. So it hasn't sort of managed to refine itself to the point where it can be treated as a sort of a robust construct. So that's why I'm not going to talk anymore about organisational resilience, but I'm going to focus on individual resilience. So I think a better way to conceptualize organisational resilience and its distinction from individual resilience is to think about organisational resilience as robustness. And this is defined as a complex system's ability to be able to remain functional in the face of shocks or disturbances. So it's more of a sort of a rock analogy, I guess, where shocks are coming in and the organisation is able to repel those sort of shocks, and this is about the organisation staying on track. Whereas individual resilience is absorbing the shock and facing a setback, but able to bounce back from that adversity, and that ability to be able to absorb a shock, which is the sort of human characteristic, I guess, allows an organisation to have redundancy within it. So the resilience creates redundancy. So resilience is about the ability to recover, and robustness is about the ability to stay on track. So I think in the literature, and when you hear people talking about resilience, they may be talking about resilience in three different ways, and I think it's important to be very clear about how we're using the term resilience here. So first of all, I'll talk about the idea of resisting. So this is if you take two people and you put them under the same amount of stress, or keep on putting more and more stress on them, how much does that negatively affect their well-being? And the person who can take the most amount of stress has the sort of highest level of resilience, as it were. But I would call that resist, it's the person's ability to be able to resist stress. And then at the end here we have this idea of rejuvenate, which is resilience is used as being, well, can people bounce back beyond their previous level of well-being? So and I think this sort of originates from this idea that stress is kind of good, and it sort of drives people's ability to be able to flourish and grow. The U-shaped stress curve, that maybe the inverted U-shaped stress curve that maybe you've seen. So I don't think it's that either. And what we are going to use as our definition of resilience is this idea of, say, having a spring, and you can pull the spring to a certain point, and beyond a certain point, its point of elasticity or its elastic limit, it won't go back to its previous form. So any point up to that kind of breaking point, as it were, the spring will be able to bounce back to its original form, and we call that resilience. And I guess you could measure how far you can pull that string so that it will be able to bounce back. And this is, I guess what we're talking about when we talk about redundancy within the system, that the spring sort of has redundancy in terms of how long you can pull it. So we're going to stick with this middle definition of resilience. So these are the popular sort of conceptualizations of resilience, the ability of an individual to rebound. So we've got rebound here, and I've just put resilience up the top there. In Latin means leap back or rebound. The ability to maintain psychological and physical health despite exposure to events. I'm not sure whether that's more of the rejuvenate kind of emphasis there. And in organisational development and change, an employee's capacity to sustain, to bounce back again from problems, conflicts, or lack of success, or situations that increase responsibility. So I think that more recent definition is probably maybe the one that we will use. But the idea of bounce back is a common theme here. This idea of thriving, not surviving in stressful times, I think maybe is more of the rejuvenate kind of definition. But I'll leave that up to you to think about that a bit more. But I think those three different conceptions of resilience are important to understand where maybe all these different definitions come from that we see in psychology and organisational change. But anyway, just to reiterate, we're going to use the bounce back definition. And I just thought, a nice way to conceptualize this maybe is just to think of resilience as sort of is it a hard diamond or is it a blob? And initially, when I was building the change capability model, I used the diamond as a way to represent resilience. But in fact, on reading more about resilience, I think it's more like a blob, that the blob is able to absorb a certain amount of external pressure or stressor, but is then able to sort of bounce back into some form or other. The idea of the diamond is more of that sort of resist, that I can throw things at it and they just sort of ping off, which is more of the sort of concept around robustness of organisations. So maybe that helps to get your head around those different ideas of what resilience is. And I've talked about this idea of energy stock, and this idea of energy stock is also used in neuroscience as well, and it's used in organisational developing this idea of jobs demand resource model, which sort of says that there are demands on us at work and there are resources that we can pull on, and what we're trying to do is balance those two sides. So a crisis is a demand on us, weak leadership where we're not really sure what we're doing or where we're going, poor decision making, unhelpful criticism, unrealistic targets. These are all drains on our energy stock, but things that can push up our energy stock, that can help us bounce back, as we saw that are predictors of resilience, are things like supervisory support and having clarity over our roles, feeling that we can be ourselves at work, etc. So all I've done here is just try to tie together the idea of resilience with the job demand resource model, which you can read more about. And there's evidence as well that job demand resource model is also related to burnout. So if people aren't able to bounce back after negative experience, adverse experiences, then they burn out. So burnout is related to resilience as well. And we'll talk about that in more detail, of how burnout, resilience, engagement, well-being all sort of tie together as well. So this is just to show that all these different areas within the organisational change capability model are potentially all interrelated, because we've got to be able to do a diagnostic on the organisation to understand what the balance of these demands and resources are. And as I said, we're trying to get into credit. So if we feel that we've just been through a major organisation change, one way we can drive up credit is to increase psychological safety, sense of autonomy, role clarity, etc. And obviously during periods of change, the organisation might be in crisis. They might show weak leadership because nobody's really sure how to respond to the challenge. Maybe there are unrealistic targets and poor decision making because we've never been here before. So I think that's a nice way to conceptualise resilience and how we can bounce back from potential negative effects of change, as well as the opportunity. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about why resilience is so important, what it is, and how do we make it work in practice that come with change. So how do we make change work in practice? Well, here we've got that model again about, or just remind ourselves what we mean by individual resilience. And we've got these predictors here and the outcomes. And I guess what we're asking here is, how can we dial up those predictors to make sure that we've got plenty of stock or resilience to be able to bounce back during periods of change. So the good news is that there's lots of high quality research that shows that certain interventions can drive resilience, individual resilience, and this is high quality research that we have, sort of randomized controlled trials and lots of systematic reviews where lots of information, lots of data is pulled together to show that these interventions will work. And most of these interventions involve techniques around, as you can see here, self-awareness, critical reflection, relaxation, mindfulness, in combination with goal setting, coaching, and sort of group discussions as well. So if we kind of do all of these things, then we're likely to build resilience. And we talked about, the need for clear goal setting, clear purpose, sense of coherence as a potential driver for resilience, and that went all the way back to the organisational change capability model that we looked at, and also support as well, which is the sort of these group discussions and maybe coaching sessions as well, that I know that there is support there for me. But what seems to be most effective, and we talked about this, is cognitive behavioural therapy, or which builds sort of psychological capital. This idea that I mentioned before about feeling positive about change, and that hope model as well. And what cognitive behavioural therapy does, as I mentioned, is sort of look at how we're perceiving the world and how our perceptions change the way that we interact and act with the world, which are the part of the sort of mechanics of neuroscience, of us predicting what the world should be like, and then acting on that world, and trying to minimize surprise, as it were, which is going to use up our energy stock. So we try to sort of reframe things by changing our beliefs or changing our sampling of the world that we're interacting with. And we also know from the research that the content of those interventions affects outcomes. So the content around CBT and building psychological capital have bigger effects than relaxation and mindfulness. The time that it takes, so 4 to 5 week interventions, so interventions that span 4 to 5 weeks, are more effective than longer time scales, sort of 8 to 12 weeks. And we know that if we do the delivery through one-to-one, face-to-face or group discussions, has the biggest impact. And if we get this right, then that will drive efficacy and people's ability to be able to adapt. And just to build on that, these are some useful diagrams, I think, from Science for Work. So go to their site because they do great summaries of research. And it just shows, how much more effective coaching is in terms of building resilience, and it also gives you a guidance on the best practices for maximising training effectiveness. So doing a sort of before training analysis review of what the job tasks are, and get organisational data and people data together to see what's going on. And then what to do during the training and after the training to make sure that you maximise training success. And then, of course, this all assumes that we can measure resilience, and because the concept of resilience is such a robust construct, and we're very clear on what we mean by it to a degree, although we've discussed that, there is this fairly robust scale that you can use to measure resilience. And in the organisational change capability assessment model, we use these 4 questions, which seem to have the highest, or seem to be able to explain resilience, individual resilience the most, which is: I successfully manage a high workload for long periods of time. So again, how much am I eating into my energy stock? I re-evaluate my performance and continually improve the way I work. So this is, I guess, maybe where the cognitive behavioural therapy comes in as well. How I am thinking the way that I work, and positioning my perceptions about how I work. And I effectively respond to feedback, so I'm open to learning, and I'm being adaptive and changing my beliefs to accommodate a changing world, or the kind of skills that I need in order to adapt to the changes that are kind of being imposed on the organisation. And those changes are an opportunity for growth, again reinforcing that, using that feedback and constantly learning from potentially what could be negative experiences. So this is the 9-point scale, which I think is available to use. And if you're not going to use the scale that we talked about in the previous slide to measure resilience, I think there are other ways of measuring resilience. And if you think about the way that I've couched resilience as being this sort of energy stock, or body budget, as it were, then if you are measuring engagement, you should be measuring engagement using at very minimum these 3 questions. So at my work, I feel bursting with energy, I'm enthusiastic about my job, and I'm immersed in my work. Again, these are measuring the physical, emotional and cognitive energy that I have available to put into my work. So how engaged am I in my work? But also, if you look at this Maslach burnout inventory, I think I've got the pronunciation right, I don't know, there's similar sort of ideas and concepts around I feel tired, I'm at the end of my patience, I'm afraid this job is making me uncaring. So again, it's about that body budget, that level of energy that I can expend in my work. And also who 5 measures of well-being. I have felt active and vigorous. It was sort of that physical side of energy. I feel cheerful and in good spirits. It's probably the emotional bit in my day-to-day life is filled with things that interest me, which may be the sort of cognitive side of those 3 measures of engagement. So you can see how all of these measures are really kind of measuring very similar things. So if you are using one of these 3 measures, then that will give you a good idea of the sort of body budgets that you have and the level of potential resilience there is within the organisation without maybe measuring resilience directly. And I guess this also emphasises why it's so important to accurately measure engagement, and then we're not using measures like employee net promoter scores, which have no relationship with concepts of engagement at all and don't help you understand whether there is what the energy levels are like within the organisation. And I just wonder whether this conceptualization of resilience and well-being worked for you. I mean, this is a model that Adam Brown from NYU Langone Health University has sort of proposed, and it sees resilience as a moderator for work related stress. So here we've got learning, the idea of mastery. Again, we've got support and physiological regulation, which is my ability to manage my own body budget, and all those things feed into this feeling of efficacy, that I can do something, that I have the energy to do it, that I have the support to do it, that I potentially have the skills to do it, and I'm open to learning to be able to do it. And that allows me to then respond to stress positively, because when I get in a stressful situation, I have that feeling of efficacy that yes, I can do this, and that response to stress has an indirect effect on resilience, because I'm problem solving and able to find ways around and reframe the stressor, which makes me more resilient. And then I can use that experience of gaining resilience, or maybe not, and that plugs back into my sort of learning, and we go on this journey of constantly trying to build up our resilience. And if you can create this within your teams or conversations with individuals within your teams during change, then obviously that's going to be extremely beneficial in helping people cope with organisational change. So thank you so much for joining this session on resilience, and particularly focusing on individual resilience. I do hope that you go away and have a look at the sources of evidence that I've used, and not take my view or my interpretation of all of this as sort of fact. But what I have tried to do is just to try and join up some of the dots and just try and give a narrative around why resilience is important for change, and some of the interventions that you can use. So if you want to watch some of the other videos that we've done, please go to the YouTube channel, and also please join us for our future sessions. Thanks again. Bye now. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about why resilience is so important, what it is, and how do we make it work in practice.